Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 106 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Dr. Richard Olsen, director of the U.S. National Arboretum, all about ancient plants. And you don't want to miss his recommendations for a dinosaur-themed garden for your own. The plant profile is on Gladioli, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some local upcoming garden events and some recommendations for summer garden reading. This episode, we're joined by Dr. Richard Olsen, Arboretum Director at the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Olsen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, Kathy. This is wonderful.
Thank you for joining us. So our overall topic today is going to be on ancient plants, those plants that preceded, I think, human civilization is what we'll mostly be talking about, and maybe how they took care of themselves before even human intervention, right? They didn't really need us.
Right, yeah. There's very few that have ever needed us. Unfortunately, there's more that need us now, but
Yep.
before us, they were doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm. But before we dive into that big topic, let's talk a little bit about you and your background, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about the Arboretum and people's experiences and how to visit that. So I'll say, Baby Richard, dialing it way, way back. Were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and a green thumb?
Yeah, maybe a little bit, I guess. My earliest memories were gardening in Wisconsin, where it was there's pretty much three plants that come to mind. Rhubarb in the vegetable garden, the giant rhubarb that you can, as you know, you can grow in cooler climates much better than here. And planting silver maples at our parents' new house. I was born in 1975, just to date myself. And, silver maples were extremely popular in the North then, still are. And then riding my bike through cattails and tall grass prairies up there in Wisconsin. But I grew up in North Carolina, which is where I cut my teeth out in the landscape, and my parents just helping out. And the real sort of hook was I was really heavy into Boy Scouts, loved being outdoors, and so wanted to come up with some sort of way to spend my life working outdoors with plants.
I think a lot of our previous guests have been scouts, whether Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts. So that really is a great introduction for the natural world. I was a brownie and junior myself for several years.
Yeah, it's growing up in North Carolina in the 1980s, it was pretty easy to get in the car and be outdoors, out camping, and so yeah, it was pretty seminal. But and still involved today with my kids. So that's it's great that they're having that experience as well. So.
And I'm glad you mentioned rhubarb in Wisconsin and how it doesn't do so well for us here, because I do get that occasional question from Washington Gardener magazine reader or a GardenDC listener of how to grow rhubarb in our area. And I'm like,
Yeah. Well, I usually tell people when you're a stream-side plant from the Himalayas, you don't do well in Washington, D.C. So that might help paint the picture.
Yeah, that's framing it very well. So you had a childhood outdoor loving plants, exploring, and then when you went to college, what was your intention with your first degree?
Yeah, well, yeah, long story short, but yeah, my first degree was not landscape architecture. My first attempt was not landscape architecture, landscape design. But anyways, I found myself in horticulture and landscape design. And so the idea was, again, I'm not going to sit at a desk all day and be on a computer. I'm going to be, out in the field, designing landscapes, planting plants, working with clients. And so, yeah, the first degree is horticultural science, NC State, landscape design emphasis. And the plant part was just easy for me because the language I chose in high school was Latin, of all things. And so, after high school, 4 years, 3 years of Latin, when you learn plant names, you get it. It wasn't a struggle; it all made sense. But the my professor at the time, well, I had several great professors at NC State in the 1990s. Said, "Look, if you're gonna, you should teach, or if you're interested in teaching, which I was in design, you should go get an advanced degree, but don't get it in landscape design. You've already got that. Get an MS or get a PhD." And I thought, "Oh, okay, well." So I went down this road to get a PhD and fell in love during my master's with plant physiology, ecophysiology, the relationship of how plants adaptations make them successful in their natural habitats, but then again, how you translate that into a garden. So, and then that just sort of fell into, okay, well, now I understand that. Well, let's make better plants. And so my PhD was in plant breeding and genetics. But it's interesting because one of the plants that I worked on, the plant I worked on for my master's is Elysium, the genus Elysium, Anise family. And it's actually a plant we'll talk about today later.
Great. And what was your thesis on for your doctorate?
Oh, good Lord. It's the longest title ever produced out of NC State horticulture department. But in short, it was um, uh, the it was regarding how to restore fertility in wide hybrids using um, mitotic inhibitors producing fertile allotetraploids. So it's a little bit involved, but basically the idea was when you breed plants and animals, oftentimes they're close enough that you can cross them successfully. Think of a horse and a donkey, and you get a mule, right? Well, we all know mules are sterile for a couple reasons, but that produces a breeding bottleneck, especially in the world of plants where there's so much diversity to work with, close relatives. So you have to overcome this sort of sterile hybrid issue. And so one way you do that is you double the chromosomes, restore fertility, and then continue to breed with them. So that's sort of a pretty common old school technique, but it was facilitated in the 1990s and the 2000s with really the development of some new technology, flow cytometers, that allowed you to understand the ploidy levels and chromosomes much easier than in the old days. And so, and long story short, I was restoring fertility to continue breeding in some woody plants.
Interesting. And so, right out of college or after your doctorate, did you join the Arboretum at that stage, or when did you come to the Arboretum?
Yeah, actually, I did. I still, pinch myself. I can't believe that the there was really only at the time there was only two jobs open in plant breeding or anything related to plant breeding in the United States. It wasn't a really this was in the 2000s. There wasn't a lot of opportunity, unfortunately, or fortunately. But one of them was this position at the National Arboretum, and it was written for me. It was not the director, but it was the research geneticist for the urban tree breeding program. So everything I was actually trained in doing was perfect for this position at the National Arboretum, to join the plant breeders and to join the staff. So I just, the only thing I did between finishing my PhD and starting at the National Arboretum was taking a trip to the Galapagos with my wife. So other than that, yeah, I've been working at the Arboretum ever since.
Wow. So it's kind of like that right plant, right place um, theory, but with human beings.
Yeah, it was very good timing.
And so, before we dive into our ancient trees, let's talk a little bit about your home garden. And I know listeners would like to know what you're growing yourself. What are you passionate about?
Oh my goodness, what am I passionate about? This is my second garden in the DC area. Up in Beltsville, Maryland, actually not far from the USDA ARS Beltsville campus, and I'm about a half acre, and the front yard is I'm working on restoring. I'm letting It's a steep slope. I'm actually working on a prairie or not a prairie, but it's wild grasses, wildflowers coming in. So I've been
Hmm.
letting spontaneous broom sedge go move in, spiderworts I've been encouraging. So it's basically a meadow planting, which is really fun. Nowadays, when we think of ecosystem services and new management for gardens and pollinators, it's really fun to luxury to have that little space where I can do that. But then in the backyard is sort of the protected from the deer, so I get to experiment more. But I'm actually doing it's kind of a Piedmont oak savanna prairie as well in the back, trying to do again more grasses. I love the serpentine natural areas that are unique to this part of the Mid-Atlantic, and studying those and looking for good plants. And that surrounds a gravel garden. The gravel gardens are pretty hot. My gravel garden is around a fire pit. So have things like native dwarf wild petunias, not petunia, but Ruellia, the genus Ruellia, seeding around, and chrysolepis, and it's just a little bit of everything. It's just really neat. And one side is dedicated to my love of woodland plants and all things either. So I didn't give you much specifics, but I have a little bit of everything.
You're the director of the Arboretum. I'm wondering if your neighbors are like, what type of garden does the director of the Arboretum have, and what did they say to you about your garden?
Yeah, they definitely know, and it usually comes down to advice on trees and plantings. But I've been spreading plants out. I just gave my neighbor one of the new double taker quinces, the new sort of generation of flowering quinces produced by Dr. Tom Randy at NC State. I also have a new flamethrower redbud, which you may know, Kathy, is relatively new, pretty exciting, produced by Dr. Denny Werner from NC State. I know it sounds like I'm an NC State bias, but there's a lot of great breeding, as you know, that's been coming out of there over the last 20 years. And but we have a lot of good gardeners. We actually have, the Four Seasons Garden Club, Kathy, you're familiar with. I think there's a couple up the street that has a spectacular garden. So one of these days we may have a garden crawl to open our gardens to everybody.
Nice, that would be great. Yeah, and that flamethrower Cercis or redbud that you mentioned is so incredible looking. So if anybody wants to Google a picture of that, that just looks like, fire on the branches.
Yeah, it's spectacular. Yeah, I came back in a minivan from North Carolina last year. The kids had to move the branches out of the way so they could have room in their seats. But yeah, it's amazing. So
So plants versus kids. Is that what you
exactly. Yep.
said? Okay. So for our topic today, we're talking about ancient, and I want to emphasize ancient meaning not just something bred, in the last few hundred years, but something that's lasted millennia on the planet Earth. And so maybe we'll go and dial it back to maybe what is the oldest living plant family that still is in existence. Maybe not the individual plant, because I know there's trees that are thousands of years old, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
the species is the oldest.
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll speak sort of in general terms, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the sort of premise for this was thinking, you always hear astronomers and physicists, and they talk about time traveling when you look at starlight, right? You've got the Hubble spacecraft looking back to the origins of the universe, or the James Webb. And I'm thinking, starlight is not the only time traveler. We have plants on this planet that have been around since essentially the dawn of angiosperms or gymnosperms or whatever plant group. And so, yeah, lower plants, mosses, algae, of course, been around 500 million years or so. But when we think about our gardens and we think about what we're growing, the ferns are some of the earliest vascular. And we talk about vascular, do you have internal plumbing that will allow you to grow vertical, which is really what happens, right? Mosses are short, algae is short. They don't have a system to get to move up, more or less. So So with the rise of vascular plants 400 million years ago, we're really talking about what you're burning in your cars, the Carboniferous period, the ferns, horsetails, and certainly in our gardens, ferns are amazing. Horsetails are amazing. A lot of people don't grow them because they're like bamboo; they'll take over.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, I think at the National Arboretum and thinking of what we grow and what we have, and again seeing everyone visiting the Arboretum, and I don't think people realize how old the lineages of some of those trees and shrubs are. Um, and I think probably the first one that comes to mind are that people would see and grow are the cycads. And of course, people would think of them as palms, but they're actually more primitive than palms. So the cycad family is pretty much one of the earlier families that are still extant. And at the National Arboretum, we have the sago palm, which is pretty common in zone 8 and south coastal areas, but we have it in the National Bonsai and Pinjing Museum because we treat that pavilion as essentially a cool temperate house during the winter, so it's protected. And sago palms are used in bonsai as well, and they're also popular pot plants. So that's probably an everyday higher or plant above the mosses that folks and ferns that people wouldn't realize how old they are, is the cycads go back about 300 million years.
Wow. And when you're mentioning these plants, ferns, mosses, cycads, those are some of my favorite plants, but a lot of them I can't grow here,
Right.
especially the cycad. But when I'm amongst them, like in a temperate rainforest, like in the Pacific Northwest or elsewhere, it feels right, like it feels natural. So I'm wondering if that's part of our Jungian memory going way back, in our
Yeah.
brains.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I mean, I do think back, when as gardeners we always want to grow what we can, and I would love to grow tree ferns here. I've gardened in the Pacific Northwest where you can get away with a couple. And so yeah, there's just something amazing about that, and the primitive nature of it. So uh, yeah, I wish we could grow more, but we have a lot there. It's a group of plants. Actually, one of our retired scientists was an expert in liverworts and bryophytes, so lower plants. So there are certainly people that study and love it, and I've been to a Japanese garden one time in Japan, and they actually had a display where they labeled all of the mosses for you. So that was the first garden I've ever saw that happen.
Interesting. So after cycads, what will be our next oldest family?
Yeah, I think ones that are extant would be the ginkgo, and I think a
Mm,
lot of people are going to be familiar with ginkgo. Maybe take it for granted, actually, how unique that is. It's the last of a lineage that goes back to 300 million years ago as well. This is with the cycads, an early seed plant, and really saw its heyday probably 150 to 45 million years ago, dispersed across the northern land masses. But it now is relegated to one species, one genus in the entire family and order that is the ginkgo from China, Ginkgo biloba. And Peter Crane, who is now the director of Oak Spring Foundation out in Virginia, incredible paleobotanist, and many people will know him as either the former dean of the Yale School of Forestry, or Chicago Field Museum, or in our world, Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, where he was the director.
mm-hmm.
He wrote a book on ginkgo, and he has a great quote. This is, "There is no other living tree with a prehistory so deeply intertwined with that of our planet." So really, ginkgo and cycads share a primitive pollination mechanism. Uh, they're primitive. Again, they're in the sort of the gymnosperms, where they're seeds that are not surrounded by a carpel or in a fruit. And so, yeah, ginkgo is just an amazing remnant of a once widespread um, group of plants. And I think Peter even called it the platypus of the plant world. And what's amazing is that it persisted in valleys in Southeast Asia, really China, and became so well appreciated for various reasons in human culture and society. It's the fruit, the nut is edible, or the seed is edible. There's a lot of symbolism with the tree. Amazingly ancient specimens in this area, by the way. Tyler Arboretum, Kathy, I'm sure you're probably familiar with Tyler, north of here in Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
has absolutely amazing specimen. I think it's better than even the one at Longwood Gardens. And so these are very long-lived organisms. So ginkgo is something common street tree. We have dwarf forms in our Gotelli, the conifer collection. But yes, ginkgos are pretty amazing and go back. They made it up, in other species made it up to the last ice age. So we have fossil record in North America and in Europe. But by the last ice age, the species went extinct in the northern hemisphere, other than the one that was left in China. So
Well, I always think, because I love ginkgo so much, that those fossil remnants that you talked about for the North American ginkgo, if Jurassic Park was real, we
mm-hmm.
could bring those back to life somehow. That would be so incredible to have those North American ginkgos as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the fossil record, it's, this is where one of the terms that you'll hear, living fossil, where so little evolutionary change has occurred over time that when you look at the fossil record and you look at the living extant species, they're so similar. You think that they really haven't evolved or changed. But yeah, the diversity that was present in the ginkgo side of the plant tree here uh, was much more in the past, and so here's what we have. And not enough tissue left to resurrect them, I guess,
Hmm.
in the fossil record, or no tissue really. So,
Yeah, maybe sometime they'll dig up a mastodon with something in its stomach or
oh, that would be cool.
something.
Yeah, yeah,
We'll keep looking for that.
yeah.
But I was gonna say, you don't fix perfect, right? Once you've got to that pinnacle, that peak of your life cycle, you just keep on replicating yourself.
Yeah. That's it's interesting. Not to digress, but when plants are not evolving, there's no end goal, right? When you evolve, when you adapt, and when you are successful in a niche, and that niche is stable, then unless something disrupts it, there's no need. As long as you're reproducing and going, there's nothing that says you have to change. And so we'll come to a plant later that I think will highlight that as another ancient lineage. Um, but yeah, so
So when you're successful and you can keep reproducing and keep living and reproducing, then you found your niche,
yep,
basically.
yep.
And then I was going to say about ginkgos, they do get a bad reputation in Washington, D.C., stinky ginkgos because of the drop fruit.
Yeah, and people don't realize, they're separate female and male plants, and
Hmm.
what the nursery industry has been doing is selecting for male plants, because to avoid that fruit. It's not a fruit technically. We can't call it that, but botanically, right? But yeah, for all intents and purposes, the fruit of the ginkgo, yeah, it can be quite rancid. And but it's edible seed, so you will see communities that appreciate that, collecting and cleaning and roasting. And if you ever travel to Japan or China, it's not uncommon to be served ginkgo nuts.
Hmm. Yeah, it is just, I think it's like the early fall when you come around a corner in the city and that smell hits you in the face and you're like, did I step in something?
Yep, yep,
But it's very brief period and the trees are beautiful outside of that. And low maintenance too, aside
yep.
from, again, the dropping of the fruits on the sidewalk, which pretty easy to clean up after with a
Yeah,
hose
yeah,
spray.
yeah.
So you had mentioned, before we jump into the next plant, the study of paleobotany. So let's talk about that for a little second.
Right. Yeah. So, again, I'm not a paleobotanist, so I may get in trouble here. But yeah, really, it's basically the study of ancient plants, the fossil record, and what a lot of people don't kind of think about is the fossil record. A lot of the really important fossil record are what would be termed microfossils. These are just plant fragments, right? It's rare for you to have perfectly preserved fossil that has the flower, fruit, branch, bark all connected, right? So especially the earlier you go in in the plant record, the more that these microfossils, you're looking at pollen, particularly pollen is well preserved. Maybe carbonized remains or fragments, leaf fragments. And so, yeah, putting all that together is an amazing, really complex science to me. And I can only scratch the surface of it. But the interesting thing for today's conversation with that is one of the most important historic fossil records was called the Potomac Group, which is named for this area. There's the formations. I think it's the Patuxent, the Patapsco, and Arundel clay that was all around this area where a lot of the early microfossils were being studied, and gave us this notion of what the early angiosperm, in particular, I'm talking about flowering plants now here, what it looked like. And it's interesting because just outside DC, we're just a mile or so from the National Arboretum, is the type location for a plant called Anacostia marylandensis. So the genus is named after the river and named after Maryland. It's off of Kenilworth Avenue. No one would ever think twice. And that species is in essentially the plant lineage, the family early angiosperms that includes things like Elysium, which I mentioned earlier, I worked on my master's, and the anise trees. And so right here we have this fossil record that includes one of, an important record right beneath our feet of what it looked like all that long ago. And there's a number of things in that record that are reflected actually in our gardens today and at the National Arboretum. So we can jump to that, because if we do, we're going to skip about the evolution of conifers, because we don't have all day. But conifers do go back, obviously. They're with the gymnosperms, they go back to 300 plus million years ago. The joint firs, not a lot of people know about the joint firs and ephedra, but I will just show the genus that's extant today is ephedra. And if it sounds familiar, yes, that's where ephedrine comes from. If you're from the western part of the country, you may be familiar with the plant called Mormon tea, which is an ephedra. These are joint firs, primitive seed plants. And actually, the one little interesting note is that one of those species, ephedra viridis, the green Mormon tea, was actually described by Dr. Frederick Colville, who was the first director of the National Arboretum. So a little connection there.
Then we were up to where you were saying that there's a connection between those plants and what we're growing in our gardens today.
Right. Yes. Right. So in that plant record, if you look at the earliest angiosperms, and now we're talking about let's say the plants with flowers, showy flowers often, but in that record, you would see things that we still grow, the water lilies. So the water lilies and nymphales, that group of plants is one of the more primitive angiosperms. And when you walk in the National Arboretum and you see the pretty water lilies and they're just magnificent, you think, well, these must be some of the most advanced plants on the planet because they're so exquisitely beautiful. And it's actually no, they're actually date back. They're living species of a lineage that really was at the dawn of the evolution of flowering plants. And I like that because a shout out to the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens across the river from the National Arboretum. It's a great place to go in the heat of the summer and see the water lilies.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I love the water lilies there. And I was just going to say, I do remember a big mural, and maybe this was in the dinosaur hall at the Natural History Museum downtown in DC, where it shows, kind of swampy areas and cypress trees and water lilies. So that does make sense now, that the correlation between that.
You would also see, again, I mentioned Elysium. So it's a popular group of shrubs in the trade now. They've sort of had a resurgent. The anise, we'll call them the anise shrubs, I guess. Mostly around here, Elysium floridanum, the Florida anise, and Alyssium parviflorum, the yellow anise. And what's nice about these, we have about 2 or 3 species in North America. There's some in the Caribbean. The rest are in Southeast Asia. So it represents this notion of disjunct genera, these plants that are found in the southeastern or eastern United States, and their closest relatives are in East Asia. So there's a whole history there when we talk about these plants and the spread and evolution. But you see them more now because I don't want to say they're deer tolerant, but they certainly have more deer. Deer resistant, but they're certainly deer tolerant. They have a little bit of a resurgence, and you'll see a couple new introductions. Orion is one, but yeah, the Alyssium that's a great genus, and more people should be growing it.
Deer tolerance makes sense because of the anise scent, I guess, in the wood itself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the leaves. Yeah. So it's heavily fragrant. And for those of you keeping track, if you've ever heard of Tamiflu, which is derived from an anise in Asia, Alyssium. So this is not the anise, the true anise in the herb garden. Please don't get it confused. But Alyssium are just an amazing. And again, that's how I got my master's, is working on Alyssium. So it's a wonderful group of plants and native. The two that Eastern Alyssium parviflorum, which is the yellow anise, small flower anise, little translation, is only a couple counties in Central Florida, but hardy through Zone 7. And then the Florida anise, which is a showier flower. The flowers look like sort of starfish, and is the panhandle of Florida and a little bit further in Southeast Asia, southeastern United States. And then a disjunct population are related in Mexico. So, but very cool group of plants. And I hope the gardeners pick those up in the nursery centers. So very cool.
Yeah, I've started to see them being offered more and more in nurseries and mail order catalogs and online, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, not that common yet.
No. So then I have a weird one for you, Kathy. You may be familiar with it because I know you're an excellent gardener and plant geek like I am. Well, I'm a plant geek. You're an excellent gardener and plant geek. I'm a plant geek. Excellent remains to be seen. But have you ever heard of the genus Chloranthus?
No, it doesn't sound familiar. Is there a common name with that?
I don't think it has a common name, to be honest. There's about 14 species. They're only found in East Asia. And the reason I bring it up is we actually have some in the garden. We have at the National Arboretum, we have 3 species. You can find them in we call it the Cryptomeria Walk, the entrance to the National Bonsai and Penjing Museum, where we have a lot of woodland natives from Asia and Japan. And you probably missed it in bloom. It's great little small bottle brush like white flowers in April, more or less, right when the foliage is coming out of the ground, technically. But the reason that's really interesting is the taxonomists and scientists are still trying to figure out where it fits in this early evolution of angiosperms. Some people will say they're closely related to the Magnolias. Some will say they're in between Magnolias and the Alyssium and the water lilies. And so there's still sort of a debate on how primitive. They know it's primitive, but where it sits. And it's interesting because that family is really in our is widespread in sort of the earliest angiosperm fossil record. So it's either these species are either the only things left of a widespread lineage that was once common, or something that was derived later. So it's an interesting little herbaceous perennial that's gorgeous to me when you walk in, and people will never know without interpretation that this little herbaceous plant is causing headaches for taxonomists on how primitive it is. There is one cultivar I know of called Get Shorty, which I have in my garden, which you can get from mail order nurseries. It's got purple flush to the foliage, and so it really adds another level of aesthetics. But yeah, the Chloranthus, look it up. It's a really cool group of plants. And you would never realize how primitive and important it is to understand the evolution of flowering plants.
And so you threw Magnolias in there, which we discussed with Andrew Bunting a few episodes ago, but they are also an ancient family, correct?
Yeah, they are. They're starting to sort of give rise to what we think of as they're in the Magnolias. It's a group of family that includes there's Magnolias, there's the laurels, the Lauraceae, the Piperaceae, which is actually the pepper family, and a couple others. But yeah, Magnolias are primitive. You can see that flower structure where you can't tell what the different parts of the flowers are. They sort of bleed between petals, tepals, sepals, and the terminology we use. And the other thing to just point out is, in terms of primitive, is the pollination structure is based on beetles. And so this is at a time before the the rapid radiation of flowering plants and the coevolution with the hymenoptera, the bees, and other insects. And so beetles are primitive, magnolias are primitive. That's what was getting pollinated back then. So if you're a beetle pollinated flower, you may be primitive.
And always think it's funny because primitive is an insult in, in the rest of the world, but in
That's
this
true. Yeah,
case,
yeah. That's
yeah,
probably not the best word. Yeah.
yeah, but in
Uh,
this case, it's just descriptive of, something that evolved a lot earlier, but
right. Yes.
interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, and at the National Arboretum, of course, we have we're part of the Plant Collections Network and the American Public Garden Association. It's one of our core collections. It's really popular, and so, but yeah, magnolias are typically thought of as early flowering plants. So, and then another one, if we, I know we're maybe have to worry about time, but another early group would be the sweet Betsy's, Calycanthus. I know you're familiar with that genus. We have a couple native in North America, one other in China,
Mm-hmm.
and then the next closest relative, I believe, is in Australia, of all places. But again, if you think of the flower of a Calycanthus or a sweet Betsy with that sort of often nice fragrance, sometimes okay fragrance, strap like thin like petals, again beetle and fly pollinated. Calycanthus and sweet Betsy is also, you could consider an early angiosperm in this group with the magnolias and laurels. And then we have a fossil record of its relatives in the Potomac group as well. So you're looking at Calycanthus growing at the National Arboretum, who has had relatives in essentially the same area for 100 million years, 120 million years. That's a pretty cool to think about.
Yeah, excellent. So I think my next question for you would be about the home gardener who is really dinosaur crazy, we'll call it, because we have the Jurassic series of movies coming out. The newest version is hitting the theaters soon, and I know so many. I'm going to say mostly little boys, but some little girls,
Mhm.
also adults who love dinosaurs. And I've been asked by a few people about what they would put into a dinosaur themed garden. So, what would you recommend?
Well, I would, as we mentioned earlier, you definitely need ferns. The bigger, the better. Those you would definitely make it. I would, definitely put in a sweet Betsy, a Calycanthus. You get great flowers and fall color. It's a native, and of course, if you have the room for a ginkgo, you definitely you got to have a ginkgo. But we got a few other plants that people don't think about. Even just the our native plane trees, platanus, the sycamores.
Hmm.
That group of plants goes back 120, 150 million years. And when you look at the fossil record for the plane trees, when you look at a fossil plane tree, you can look at modern plane trees, and there was far more diversity back then. But our sycamores actually are an ancient lineage that goes all the way back. One of the few that go into Gondwana, the southern, so when the few representatives of a flora that is more representative of the southern continents in the southern hemisphere. So, in fact, most people don't realize that for the plane trees, their closest relatives are the Proteaceae, the proteas of South Africa and Australia. And by the way, another one, if you have a water garden besides the water lilies we were talking about, would be just lotus. Lotus and water lilies are not closely related. It's
Nope.
you think they are, but they're not. But again, water a lotus would be a cool plant. And then after that, you get into some pretty obscure stuff. But we have records in the Potomac group here. If you're talking about Jurassic 200 million years ago, all the way to the Cretaceous and 66 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were on their way out, thanks to an asteroid, as I understand it, then you would include things like even boxwood. Most people don't even think about boxwood, but the boxwood family is a very primitive angiosperm. So even a boxwood would technically be representative of a lineage that dates to the dinosaurs.
And I imagine this would be the food of many of the dinosaurs that aren't the carnivorous ones.
Right, yeah. So it makes you wonder who was distributing a ginkgo nut. Probably would not survive a brontosaurus. Yeah, if you were, I can't speak to what the trees would have looked like, and some of these lineages were not yet trees. They could have been shrubs or other things. So we think of them as trees now, but that doesn't mean they have always been trees. But I think ginkgo is probably, yeah, you gotta. And if you have a small garden too, by the way, there are dwarf forms of ginkgos. So you can have a dinosaur garden that is contained in a townhouse in Washington, D.C.
Nice.
Suburbia. So, in fact, we have in the National Bonsai and Pinji Museum one of the specimens that I believe dates to the original gift from the people of Japan is, in fact, a ginkgo specimen bonsai that we received in 1976.
And that does bring us full circle to the U.S. National Arboretum and its mission. And maybe we'll give our last few minutes to talking about visiting the Arboretum and how people experience that and some of the collections. So it is a research facility as well for the USDA, correct?
Right. Yeah. A lot of folks don't realize that the U.S. National Arboretum was created by an act of Congress to be administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1927. So we are an economic garden. We are a collections-based research institute, and our job, our mission, is to solve and transfer technology that's important to the American nursery and landscape industry. Now, traditionally, that has been plant breeding. So we have a long history of plant breeding where we look at plant species or crops that are important to the nursery industry. And when there's a problem or a need, we would breed that. We've been breeding plants much longer. Now everyone seems to be breeding plants across everywhere. But we were doing it far earlier than most folks. And a modern example would be boxwood. You're well familiar with boxwood blight, the fungus that's been introduced. We have the national collection of boxwood. So we mobilized with the industry and with support from APHIS and from the USDA and ARS, a team across ARS to tackle boxwood blight. And our job at the National Arboretum, our scientists, are working towards breeding the next generation of boxwood that may be resistant to the boxwood blight. Boxwood is a $120 million a year crop in the United States. And so this has been devastating to that crop. And so that's our job. We step in long-term high-risk research to try to solve this problem. So even though the gardens are beautiful and the collections are beautiful and our team and staff work very hard to do that, at the end of the day, these are working collections. We use these plants to help solve these problems facing the industry. And maybe we're not even using them, but we're distributing them across the country and across the world to other scientists and other breeders that are. So we are a repository for plants that are important to the industry. We have 29,000 accessioned plants, about 17,000 unique. And so it represents a significant part of the cultivated and conserved germplasm that's important to American gardens and landscapes.
Mm-hmm. And for most DC area citizens who would visit the Arboretum, a lot of people who aren't into plants per se, they're using it as a park. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's part of the. It's very important for us to provide that access, and they're not mutual. The two missions are not mutually exclusive. And in reality, I would, if you look at museums and visitors and how you would rank it, probably 90% of visitors to anything are not the experts. If we were only catering the National Arboretum to plant experts, it would be a small group, right?
Very true.
So it is a very important role. We're 451 acres of open green space in a heavily urbanized area. It is important, as we have found during the last couple of years, the ability to connect with nature and just get out and decompress. We know that obviously as gardeners, but the rest of the population is figuring that out, which is great. And so we have 9.5 miles of roads and trails. We have more than that in trails and access. And so it's really important. I mean, we struggle with visitor services and access. It's just like a lot of the great national parks and forests in the United States. We struggle with maintaining that. That's not new. But we have 700,000 visitors a year now. We've grown. We've hit over 800,000 once. And so we definitely love visitors. We just have to be able to manage it. And so sometimes that is hard on plants, right? But no, it's very important. That's why we exist. We exist because the American people said, we need a place like this. And Congress passed the act, and it was signed by Calvin Coolidge. And so here we are nearly 100 years later, fulfilling a very important need for the American people. So they're not mutually exclusive mission.
And I would say that green space was super important over these past few years for a lot of local citizens. That was the largest amount of green space they could access locally and be outside safely.
Right. Yeah. No, at a time we were one of the few things that were open. And it's, again, we had a lot of people thanking us to be open. And I think, if we can mobilize all of that, as we approach our second centennial or our first centennial, or second centenary, second century, I should say. We need all the fans and help we can to support the National Arboretum. And it's important we have partners like the Friends of the National Arboretum and the National Bonsai Foundation, where folks can be involved, be members, find out what's going on at the National Arboretum. That public-private partnership is really important for us to leverage with the funds we receive from Congress. So we're all in it together, and I think we have something beautiful. It's often called the hidden gem of Washington, D.C., but I think it's been discovered. So now we got to make it even better.
I would definitely agree. I hear that hidden gem being applied to Kenilworth, water lilies and several other things, but I think they've discovered them now, especially your property, the Arboretum. So for more information or how to contact you, where would people find that?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. On the web, we are at www.usna.usga.gov. But if you type in National Arboretum, it pretty much pops up pretty quickly. And through the website, we have our contacts. I'm real easy. Everyone in the government is essentially richard.olsen@usda.gov, or just call our front desk too. And if you have questions or anything, comments, we'll direct it to the right people to try to get them addressed and answered. And I'll be glad to answer whatever I can as well. This is the fun part of the job.
And thank you, Richard. I think we only, kind of the tip of the iceberg is what we covered today. So we have so much. So we definitely want you back on the GardenDC podcast to talk about more plant topics and maybe even the herbarium collection and other missions of the Arboretum. And as you're approaching your century mark, we'll definitely be doing more coverage of that.
Excellent. Yeah, no, we've got a great team and a lot of staff expertise here. I love to talk as well. So if it's not me, it's going to be someone, but I love doing this. So if you have me back, I will do it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Gladiolus plant profile. This summer blooming bulb is known for its showy flowers that come in a variety of colors. My favorites are the chartreuse green, but I also enjoy the lavenders and pink blends as well. Gladiolus can be planted in spring after the last spring frost and come up in midsummer, about 90 days from planting. After that, it will behave as a perennial in your garden if you mulch it well. Be sure to plant the bulb deep enough and give it extra winter protection if you're in zone 6 or lower. Gladiolas require full sun for best blooming and may need some staking if they are not supported by surrounding plants. After blooming, remove the faded flowers and then cut the whole stalk down. You can also cut the stalk when just a few blooms are open to enjoy the rest as they open up in your indoor arrangements. Gladiolus, you can grow that. What's new this week? Well, over at the community garden, it's been a soggy one. So I've tried to stay out of the oversaturated soils and am holding off on doing some of my summer planting. But I'm still harvesting strawberries and weeding a bit, checking on the garlic and carrots as they develop. And finally, I have flowers forming on my snap peas, so I should have peas soon. Also, the thornless blackberry is forming tons of fruit, so I'm looking forward to having that ripen in a few weeks. And I spotted some self-sowing zinnia and celosia seedlings. I will be moving those around to a better spot since, of course, they popped up right where I want to plant my tomatoes. In my home garden, I am enjoying the last of the peony blooms that didn't get shattered in the storms. My roses are looking especially wonderful this week, and they are enjoying all the extra moisture. And I've been cutting blooms to enjoy inside of my mock orange because that scent is just so intoxicating. I want to give a quick shout out to listener Jack Bosma for your wonderful voicemail message and to all of our listeners for your support and feedback. And one thing I wanted to share is some summer reading choices. So as we are going into Memorial Day weekend and jumping into summer, I thought some garden reading recommendations might be in order. There's a wonderful book by Mary Kate Mackey and Kathleen Norris Brenzel, The Healthy Garden, Simple Steps for a Greener World, easily digestible chapters on sustainable gardening that are just wonderful. Next is Garden Variety. It's a novel, so it is fiction by Christy Wilhelmy, and that is about the adventures of the residents around a community garden and the community garden that they garden together in. So check that one out for some fun beach reading. And then for some more practical gardening information, I'm recommending my friend Kim Roman's book, How to Garden Indoors and Grow Your Own Food Year-Round. And that one is a great one, especially if you are in an apartment or don't have extensive places to grow edibles. She has really fun and inspiring options for that. So you can find the book reviews for that in our May 2022 issue of Washington Gardener magazine. And all of those books, of course, are available on Amazon and Bookshop and wherever you find great gardening books. And some upcoming events to let you know about. We are going to be at Valley View Farm on June 5th, and that is a Q&A garden book party from 2 to 3 p.m. Valley View is in Cockeysville, Hunt Valley, Maryland, just outside of Baltimore, and we is Kathy Jentz, myself, and Terry Spate, my co-author. We're going to be selling and signing our book, The Urban Garden, and Terry will be signing and selling her book, Black Flora, and Kim Roman, who I just mentioned, will also have her book, How to Garden Indoors, with her as well for signing and selling, and we'll be answering your gardening questions. And then on June 18th, which is also a Saturday at 2 p.m., I will be giving a talk on can't fail containers at Patuxent Nursery in Bowie, Maryland. During that talk, I will be putting together a container, mixed container, and then at the end, of that talk and demonstration, one lucky winner will be selected to take home that demonstration planting. It's free to attend. You can find out more about that at patuxentnursery.com. Happy gardening!
In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spite, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space, while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. The Urban Garden, 101 Ways to Grow Food and Beauty in the City, comes out this spring. You can pre-order it now at Amazon.com and bookshop.org.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at WashingtonGardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.